I'd like to begin this discussion looking back along the history of evolution to Darwin. Darwin came up with the idea of natural selection. Alfred Wallace actually came up with it independently. And at the time, it was quite controversial. People were still very worried that these advances and understanding of the long history of the Earth might have social implications and that it conflicted with some religious views, so it was controversial, and to some extent even it still is today. And so Darwin was aware of the cultural impact of what he was doing and knew it would be controversial, but he was convinced that his ideas on natural selection were right, and that's largely correct. Alfred Wallace, he wrote for like 20 years, taking notes, corresponding with colleagues, writing up and kind of doing a book, but not really organized and just kind of waiting. And there's still some debate as to why he waited so long, but it was a very long time. And in the meantime, Alfred Wallace basically came up with the exact same idea of natural selection. And this was a breakthrough. It really is a key, major element of evolutionary theory. And Darwin was right. But the thing that I want to point out is the data set that Darwin and his contemporaries like Alfred Wallace was working with. The data that they had available to them was very limited compared to what we have today. So it's remarkable what he was able to accomplish with that limited data set. And basically, what I'm talking about with a limited data set is what they could observe with a microscope, right? Which doesn't give you a huge insight into evolution. Microscopes are great tools and have many applications in evolutionary related things, but into the theory and fundamental elements of evolution, it just doesn't help much. And so they could make observations of populations around them. They had a few limited tools, nowhere near what we have today. And with that, Darwin was able to observe all of the diversity of life on Earth. And I like this quote. And it's one of the most famous, maybe the most famous quote of Darwin. But it really highlights this idea that they are looking at forms, right? Structures, morphological features. And they are using that to try and drill down to the fundamental underlying mechanisms of evolution. And so it really is remarkable that they were able to figure out this idea of natural selection and that it was right and was critical. But I want you to recognize that natural selection is only a very small part of evolution overall. And not only that, but the parts of natural selection that Darwin and contemporaries were able to view and to observe, right? Those things that are preserved in living populations and maybe a little bit of fossils. They were just beginning to look at and understand fossils, but really not significant at that point. But even with fossils, we only have morphological features that are maintained in populations. That's what we're seeing. And if you do a really extensive view of a large population, you can see some of the diversity and variety at the population level, but it's very hard to drill down beneath that. And so we'll look at natural selection, some of the elements that Darwin was able to view and outlined for us beautifully and elegantly in his Origin of the Species and subsequent writings. And then we'll look at elements of natural selection and implications of natural selection that Darwin was unaware of. Now, we are also going to go beyond that, and we're going to look at the two other major, I call them the big three, but the two other major forces in evolution. And that is genetic drift, which is random variation in population size due to sample size, which is our population. Random variation in populations due to the size of the population. And then we're also going to look at mutation. And Darwin really didn't have any idea about the nature of DNA or the mechanisms of DNA replication or how mutations bring in diversity into a population. He just didn't have the tools. Not his fault, but he did amazing things with what he did. Now, to introduce and kind of give you an analogy for all three of these, what I call the big three, natural selection, genetic drift, and mutation, I'm going to give you an analogy. And I don't think this is a perfect analogy. It's pretty good. And it came to me 4 or 5 years ago where in the news, popular media, it was on like every website, there was this big to-do about a gum wall in Seattle. And this is kind of gross. I think it sits in your mind and sticks in your head. Maybe that's one reason it's a good analogy. But there was this wall in like an area of downtown Seattle there were a lot of nightclubs. And so people, I don't know how it even started, but people would come out of a nightclub or a bar or whatever late at night, they'd have gum in their mouth and they'd stick it on the wall. And eventually it became this massive tradition. And the city of Seattle, of course, is kind of grossed out by it, and it's like, oh, that's maybe a health hazard. We need to fix this. And so they came with steam cleaners and cleaned all the gum off of it. And it was a big kind of controversy because it kind of become this icon, this monument. So anyway, that's the backstory. It's kind of interesting, and maybe that will make this analogy stick in your head. By the way, if you can think of a better analogy and want to let me know, by all means do that. I think this one works. So here's how I'm going to use the gum wall. Imagine that the wall itself is like a population of organisms, okay? And a piece of gum is like a mutation. It changes it. And it works fairly well because I don't know that there was any rhyme or reason. It's assuming it's fairly random. Now, in reality, it's not completely random whenever I have humans doing this. They're probably looking for open, available spaces to stick their gum and eventually fairly evenly cover the whole wall. And so that, in that way, the analogy breaks down just a little bit. We are going to assume, and there are some exceptions to this rule, but in general, mutations are completely random. They are mistakes that are made during the replication of DNA. And of course, the only ones that we're really interested in for evolution are mistakes that are made during either meiosis in sexually reproducing organisms or during mitosis for asexually reproducing organisms. Now think for a minute, why did I make that distinction? Why aren't we including mitosis in sexually reproducing organisms? So for instance, if you have a skin cell that is dividing just to replace itself because your skin sloughs off and cells replace themselves rather rapidly, and there's a mutation in it, and that mutation makes that skin cell, say, way, way, way better at blocking UV rays or maintaining moisture levels or whatever, it makes it much stronger so your skin is tougher and better able to resist injury or puncture or something like that. Why don't we care about that? Well, we understand now that if it is a mutation in a skin cell, there's no chance of that mutation being passed on to next generations. And so although it might, and even for you, it probably wouldn't be a big deal because it'd just be that one little area of your skin that had the advantage. But we could not get that to the rest of your skin, let alone on to the next generation. So for that reason, we're really only interested in meiosis in sexually reproducing organisms and the new mutations that pop up during meiosis, and mitosis for sexually reproducing organisms. So every time there's a mutation, we change the population. We get a new feature that's there. Okay, and that's like a piece of gum that's stuck on the wall. Now, whether or not that piece of gum, that new mutation in the population, becomes a common feature about the population is another thing. So realize in this analogy that a new mutation could potentially spread and be passed on in a sexually reproducing one. So this analogy breaks down here also in that the gum doesn't spread and start to take over the rest of the wall if it's better at whatever quality than the rest of the gum. So let's change our analogy a little bit now. Let's change it and let's just make this one individual, that's their entire genome. And every time they get a mutation, and maybe we're watching it through many hundreds of generations as it gets passed on to the next generation, passed on, okay? But it varies and changes, and eventually we get a very different genome than we started with, okay? So gum is like a random mutation. Now, we have two other forces we need to account for. And to do this, I'm going to tell a story where we have two different individuals who are cleaning up this gum wall. They've been hired by the city of Seattle to clean up the gum wall. All right? And so one of them just is a little lazy and kind of does it randomly. So he comes along and he hoses off some. He sits down. He picks a different part of the wall, hoses off more, picks a different one. And so he doesn't do a great job, but it's cleaning it a little bit here and there. But gum is still going to accumulate if he's the only one doing it. Okay, that is like genetic drift. Genetic drift randomly removes some mutations, and it keeps others. But there's no rhyme or reason as to which ones it's going to keep or take away. Okay. Now, the second cleaner is like natural selection, and he's a little bit different than the first. He's also a little lazy. He doesn't clean the entire wall, right? He doesn't remove all of the mutations, but he has a very specific goal in mind. And his goal, let's just say he's an AC/DC fan. And I picked AC/DC because they have this very iconic logo. you may be able to close your eyes and picture it, right? The big, bold font of AC, then a lightning bolt, and then DC, right? This heavy metal band. You can Google it, look it up if you want to. And he's an AC/DC fan. And so his goal is to carve an AC/DC symbol into the gum wall. And he's going to clean off the wall in areas where it doesn't matter. And he's going to leave the gum where those big bold A and C and D and C and the lightning bolt would be. And so you have this tribute to AC/DC and gum on the wall. Okay? Now, realize that if by chance the genetic drift cleaner, right, our cleaner who represents genetic drift, comes and cleans in that area, he might remove some or all of the gum and ruin the AC/DC sign. But that maybe is a low chance since he's so lazy and only cleaning a few parts randomly. And so natural selection works that way. Depending on the environment, it allows certain mutations that are beneficial, that are conducive to survival in that environment. It allows those to stay, and it works at removing all of the others. But realize the AC/DC guy, the natural selection stand-in, he's probably not going to care about gum in far, far away places on the wall that really don't interfere with his work of art. He's not going to spend time on those. And those would be kind of like neutral mutations. Okay, so let's define the types of mutations we can have. And there's a huge variety of mutations when we think about types of mutations, like non-disjunction of chromosomes, duplication of large regions of the chromosome. But the vast majority of mutations are just simple, single mistakes. We call those point mutations. And we'll look at them in some well, we probably won't in most of the classes where you're hearing this. You might have a background. If not, review it. Look up point mutation. But it's in essence just a single mistake that's made where we substitute out one base pair for another, or we insert or delete one base pair. And so these little tiny mutations are by far the most common type of mutation, and they're the ones that build up and that make up most of the variety and diversity that we see in our natural populations. Okay? So under this analogy, let's think what would be the end result. If we have people coming in and sticking gum on the wall all the time, we have one guy that's kind of randomly removing mutations, and we have one guy that's very specifically removing them, but in a pattern that matches his intent, or if it was natural selection, that matches what's good in the environment, removing things that are bad in the environment and keeping things that are good in the environment. We're going to start to see some fairly clear patterns. Now, because mutations are random, and we'll talk about the reasons why in our next discussion, the vast majority of these mutations are neutral. They're not good or bad for the organism. Now, you might have a different point of view if you're thinking about gum on a wall. Maybe you're grossed out and say, any new gum on the wall is bad. But if it's a mutation, it's most of the time effectively neutral. Doesn't hurt the organism, doesn't help the organism. So that's the vast, vast majority. Now, natural selection works to remove the mutations that are bad. So let's actually go to the chart here now. Now, this is mine. I haven't seen it anywhere else. It really, I think, helps illustrate the principles, and the numbers are generally true, but notice I very much ballparked these numbers. So this is the pie chart of just mutations. When a mistake happens, and again, the vast majority of those mistakes are point mutations, what is, on average, the outcome of a mutation? So this is looking at all of the mutations and trying to see general trends and patterns. So most of the time, the vast majority of the time, and I'm going to say more than 95% of the time, it's neutral. So that's the gray area in our pie chart. Now realize Darwin had no idea about this. You can't see a neutral mutation. By definition, you can't look at an organism's phenotype and see, oh, look, it's carrying X number of neutral mutations. Because they're neutral, they don't impact the organism. Now, we might be able to see a very small portion of neutral mutations if they didn't impact the fitness. So some of the diversity we see actually is there. So Darwin maybe could have seen a little bit of this neutral evolution. In fact, he wrote about some of it, not really quite directly, but indirectly a little bit. So some of the diversity we see is neutral, but the vast majority of it we just don't ever see. It's hidden because it is neutral and doesn't impact the phenotype of the organism. Okay, of the remaining mutations, less than 5% are negative. Now think about it. What is the impact of, let's come back to it at the end and talk about the impact of the two other forces of natural selection on these mutations. Okay, so start thinking about what is the impact of genetic drift and what is the impact of natural selection on a negative mutation. And by definition, a negative mutation is something that reduces the fitness of organisms that carry that mutation. And so that leaves us this tiny little sliver, and again, probably less than 0.1%, maybe much less, of these random mutations that are occurring are actually beneficial. What happens to a beneficial mutation after it occurs randomly? What is the impact of natural selection? And what is the impact of genetic drift on that positive mutation? Okay, so let's evaluate this. And these are answering these questions on here. So for neutral mutations, there is no impact at all for natural selection, right? By definition, if it's neutral, natural selection does not play a role in whether that mutation spreads through the population or is removed through the population or just kind of hangs out without moving strongly in one direction or another. That is, by definition, not an impact that natural selection can have on neutral mutations. But genetic drift acts on neutral mutations, and it acts on it in proportion to the population size. Okay, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. So hopefully you've got some background, you already know about that. But genetic drift acts equally across all mutations. So maybe we can get around that right now. If we're talking about genetic drift, it acts the same on negative, on neutral, and on positive mutations. It's exactly the same across all mutations. And the force of it is random, fluctuation up and down based on the population size. Okay? Now let's talk about natural selection. We've already said natural selection has no role at all in this vast majority of mutations. So really, for the vast majority of mutations, these neutral ones, it's only genetic drift that we need to worry about after the mutation occurs. But for these other two, this is pretty straightforward, and most people get this pretty intuitively. Okay? That if it is a negative mutation, natural selection is going to work to remove these 5% or less than 5%. Natural selection is going to work to remove those from the population. And sometimes that's a very fast, rapid process. Sometimes it's slow. But over time, negative mutations will be removed from populations. And so we would see a clear pattern over time that would emerge based on the environment, which is what has its impact on natural selection, right? So what I'd like you to do, and we'll come back in the third lecture of this series, so the third lecture on neutral theory, and I'll give you the answer to this, but maybe you could figure it out. This pie chart, right, is just mutations. This is what happens when we have mutations. 95% or more are going to be neutral, 5% are going to be negative, and then this tiny sliver are going to be positive. But what would this pie chart look like if we added in natural selection and genetic drift? So think about that. Think about the impact of genetic drift on all three of these types of mutations. Think about the impact of natural selection on all three of these mutations, and then think what would happen to these different slices in the pie. Okay? If you want to sketch it out, great. See if you can do it. And again, in the third lecture on neutral theory, we'll answer that question.